Welcome to our webinar in which we'll be talking about cybersecurity testing and how it's different than testing in general. Our speaker today is Taz Daughtry, President of @SQA, the Association for Testing and Software Quality Assurance. @SQA is the global certification body for ISTQB and ASTQB, and in fact, it is the official ISTQB exam provider for ASTQB, which is the board for the United States for ISTQB. And we're very proud and pleased to have Taz with us. Taz is an accomplished professor and just all around in-demand speaker. He's keynoted at various conferences. He has quite an extensive background in cybersecurity and security testing. So we're very pleased to have you, Taz. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Dave. I just want to take a fairly brief overview for those of you who are interested in testing and interested in how the testing of security would be different. And also for those of you who come from the angle of cybersecurity and are interested in how testing contributes to that. So the theme is the way in which testing is done differently in cybersecurity concerns, considerations. I'm thinking that there are at least three broad areas I will mention. One area in which the testing is very different because we are in an adversarial relationship. There are people that are trying to not only break, but break in and manipulate the software or the systems based on it. Also, because of that, the key element that is very unique in the area of cybersecurity testing is threat modeling. What are the potential ways in which threats will eventuate, and how do we protect against them? And that also leads to a final area that I will be mentioning, that not only is testing concerned across the broad development life cycle, but also the attack life cycle. And as I will show you in the framework we're going to look at, it deals with, from the very beginning, making sure you have enumerated and characterized your assets that you're protecting, all the way through identifying, responding to, and recovering from the attack. I know that because there's obviously an awful lot of news stories, current events popping up of all the ways in which people are trying to compromise systems, it almost seems like whack-a-mole. And it also is a constantly evolving area, so it looks like sometimes you fix one problem and a different problem pops up, or the same problem pops up in a different area. Sort of reminds me of the advice or the evaluation that the Queen gave to Alice about the difficulty of keeping up with things that are rapidly changing. And of course, in our arena, we are looking at a rapidly changing environment, not only as new software and software-based systems come online, but as there are new ways in which people try to abuse and misuse those systems. I've always said that a lot of life could be explained with the proper 2x2 matrix. And when I started thinking about cybersecurity and cybersecurity testing some while back, this was one way of representing the more comfortable area of software quality and reliability and software testing that we had previously lived in. That basically, if you look at this matrix, we basically lived and worked in the arena of that lower left-hand quadrant, where we're worried about how the software is functional and reliable, but only because if there are some defects, the defects were accidentally inserted into the software, and then the users accidentally encounter them. And the much bigger picture now in terms of security concerns is that if you move over to the lower right-hand quadrant, there are people that are intentionally looking to discover and counter and manipulate and take advantage of these various defects, which for security purposes we call vulnerabilities. Also, there are a couple of quadrants that we never really had thought about before. That is the top half of the drawing. We are looking at intentionality of people intentionally putting in defects and obviously intentionally trying to encounter those defects, even the ones that they put in. Also led me to think about there really are two types of intentional defects. They're the malicious ones. That's the very top path across the diagram, in which people will try to insert malicious software, malware. That's the intention of a lot of so-called phishing and other attempts to try to trick people into clicking on a link or opening a website or a file, because that will then put some of that malicious software in your computer and in your computer system. But just below that, interestingly enough, there are also things that we had not really thought about too much. Those are the trade-offs. Do we do things to make systems more usable, more responsive perhaps, but maybe not as secure as they might be? And of course, what you have then in the upper right-hand quadrant are the people who are intentionally looking for those defects, whatever origin they had, and trying to take advantage of that. Another way of thinking about how software testing is different is particularly requirements-based testing typically remains over on this left-hand side of the diagram. We're looking for what is the acceptable behavior. We're looking at specifications that says the system shall do this and shall do that. And we are often much less interested in the unacceptable behavior, but we may specify some things the system shall not do. But we really can't make an exhaustive list. So beyond the things that we already anticipate the system shall do and shall not do, there are all those things the system might do. And so this is where we need to cast a broader net, have a wider perspective, and as designers, as users, and certainly as testers, think about all the possibilities of the ways in which the system may be manipulated. So we're really back to the spy versus spy. And what we're looking at, in essence, are the threats to the system. And in order to protect those against those threats, we wind up placing certain controls in place that should block whatever those avenues are or remove those vulnerabilities. So this means that what we're trying to do with testing is to assess how effectively those controls are going to act against the threats. Now that means that we basically have to think about all of the possible controls that are in place, and there's quite an enumeration in some of the resources that I'll be alluding to. There are entire families of controls that make sure that the system is a little more bulletproof in terms of having resistance to these sorts of encounters that trying to take advantage or misuse it in certain ways. If you were to go back to the original idea of the word hacking, to hack, not necessarily maliciously or criminally in its original sense, hacking was just making a system do something it was not intended to do. And because we know that there are malicious actors out there who will try to make the system do what it should not be doing, we have to have all of these controls in place. Some very fundamental things like input checking, so that individuals can't just arbitrarily type in any type of information. Some of the key ways that people get into systems is just by putting inputs that no one would have imagined or a user would not typically employ. And so there are a number of ways in which people need to take advantage of all the possible controls that are available. But the real bigger issue here is what the threats are. And I've just got a couple of graphics here that just have the acronyms. You know, we're crazy about our acronyms in high tech. And so it's been well established for quite some time. There is one model of looking at the potential threats that analyze it across these particular parameters. That's the so-called DREAD model. And then there's the so-called STRIDE model. And in each of these cases, what you're doing is you're unpacking aspects of what kind of threats there might be to the system. And I guess what I would like to emphasize is one of the key areas in which we are dealing with security, cybersecurity testing, is that your testing is really no better than your threat modeling. And in fact, if the designers of the system have an insufficient threat model, they will not have installed sufficient controls. And if you then base your analysis and your testing on a similarly inadequate threat model, you're also going to miss all of the ways in which the system may come under attack and the way in which it needs to be defended. The key security factors are usually boiled down into protecting your assets and ensuring the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of those assets. The assets could be data, the assets could be processes that are taking place, but in each case, what's interesting is that these are the security attributes that need to be defended. One way of looking at that, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, which has issued a number of very helpful resources, some others of which I'll mention later, has a so-called framework for improving cybersecurity. Critical infrastructures are basically all those underlying technologies and infrastructures that we depend on: communications, energy, any of the ways in which we need to go about our daily lives and are depending upon those elements of software-based systems that essentially are required. So any of the ways we want to improve financial, transportation, any of the other elements, medical, energy provision, we look at these particular elements of identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recovering. And a very foundational place to begin is just to think about how you are going to go through this particular sequence of making sure you understand what your assets are, and then how you can protect and detect and respond and recover. So certainly at the beginning of any cybersecurity effort and a cybersecurity testing effort, what are the assets? The very first step is, and the way in which we could go really quite off target, is if we don't think about what those elements are of the attributes of our assets. What data, how important the data is. Not all assets are equally valuable. And interestingly enough, sometimes the assets are more valuable to different perspectives. So from a criminal point of view, they may value the asset in a way differently than the legitimate owner or user of the system may. So to some extent, we also have to, as I'll indicate, think like a criminal. So what I'm indicating is one of the other ways in which the cybersecurity testing is different is we have to go across this entire span. Part of the testing will simply be an analysis of an evaluation of whether we have properly identified the types of assets that are to be protected and what relative values they might have. Therefore, they need varying degrees of protection. The controls are in the protection area. And if you just stop right there, it's a pretty significant effort. But one of the really interesting things that makes cybersecurity testing so different is that we have to know that we're not going to be 100% successful with protection. And so another element of cybersecurity testing is to evaluate the effectiveness of detection. One of the real weaknesses for many systems is they don't know when they have been compromised. And we have many classic examples and case studies of many weeks to months to even years in which criminals have bored into a system and have been happily moving information out of the system, copying, altering information, overseeing whatever is going on in the system and taking advantage of that. And so a key element of cybersecurity testing is how well the system is detecting those defects. And so basically trying to trigger those things like penetration testing and the like are ways in which cybersecurity testing is evaluating that element. And then obviously once the system has been detected, once the compromise has been detected, how well does the system respond? How well do the users, the owners of the system respond? What patches they put in place? How do they keep the compromise from it continuing, and then what elements do they have for recovery? What's your business continuity? What is your recovery plan? So everything from incident response to continuity to recovery are all in the element of cybersecurity testing. And you need to evaluate not just how well they've done the protection, how well the controls are in place, but in the inevitable case where the controls fail, how quickly and how well the detection takes place, how effectively the response occurs, and how fully and quickly the recovery takes place. So obviously they have a lot of elements of criminality here. And so I think another way of thinking about how your cybersecurity testing can be organized is around the area of thinking about these as criminal activities. Obviously, my favorite movie based on a board game is the movie based on the board game Clue. And one of the things that is classic in any detective story is essentially the elements of motive, opportunity, and means. And I switch that around a little bit because typically you hear the detective stories talk about motive, means, and opportunity. But the means are really not helpful unless there is an opportunity, and the opportunity is what is often crucial in cybersecurity. And so let's look at each of these elements briefly. There are lots of criminals, lots of suspects, and the motivation of those suspects is part of your threat modeling. Who would want to take advantage of your system? Who would want to compromise the confidentiality, release secret information, or have access to information that other people don't have? Who would want to scramble the data, the integrity of the data? Who would want to block access, the availability of the system? Those are all different criminal motivations. And one of the things that I've been looking at recently is some of the literature that's emerging now on doing profiling of cyber criminals. And so there are a number of elements that need to go into that kind of profiling. It's helpful when you're trying to investigate a crime to profile the criminal. But it's also helpful to anticipate that your particular asset, your particular system would be attractive to criminals of certain sorts and criminals that would have certain motivations and have certain capabilities. And so the degree to which your controls are placed, again, back to the threat modeling, is you're anticipating what type of threat that you're going to have based on these various attributes of the criminal. And then beyond that, there's additional investigation and additional analysis that's done to talk about how that criminality, how that motivation eventuates in terms of the sorts of actions that are taken and what are the triggering events that might lead to that. All of this is very helpful in trying to do a thorough enough threat model that the controls are of the adequate kind as well as degree. Then the second portion of the sort of the triad, motive, opportunity, and means, is if there's no vulnerability that can be exploited, then there really is no opportunity, whatever the motivations might be. And this is where I think a well-informed cybersecurity testing approach should be aware of what those types of vulnerabilities are. There are some helpful resources. MITRE is one. OWASP is another organization that basically has a top 10 or top 25 list of ways in which people have vulnerabilities baked into their systems. And one of the things that's most interesting is in many cases, these are long-standing ways in which people do not do an adequate enough job of designing and implementing software systems. Just in the most recent release just a few months ago, the top types of mistakes that will be made in designing and implementing software are fairly well known and fairly common, and therefore should be one element of what you're looking for in cybersecurity testing to see that they have been anticipated and avoided by the designers and the implementers of the system. Notice particularly in this list that the top few break out as being much, much more significant, common, and much more damaging than most of the others. I'm not quite sure of what the Pareto analysis is of whether 80% of the weaknesses, or 80% of the compromise can occur from just 20% of these top weaknesses. But these are well known, and certainly we need to screen out the most common ones. The helpful thing is, if you just look at the resources available, such as that MITRE reference, there are plenty of examples of ways in which down at the coding level as well as at the design level, there are things that need to be avoided. And so there are some static analysis tools that can go through code. So a part of the cybersecurity testing would certainly be measuring the adequacy of that kind of analysis and the rigor with which the development was done, and basically was the design of the software and the implementation of the software done in a bulletproof manner. The third element after the motive and the opportunity is the means. And here's another one of the real challenges that we have, because there are just so many ways and new ways emerging all the time. Once again, there are a lot of resources and tools. MITRE actually has a very interesting tool, and just look at this, just to scan this a little bit out of focus here. Don't try to read all of that fine print, but basically there are dozens and dozens of ways that attacks can take place. So the means of attacking are so multiple, and there's so many ways that are evolving over time as well, that it's very difficult, but it's a challenge to stay on top of that. And I would suggest that that's one of the great challenges in cybersecurity testing. I actually have blurred this one out a little bit because it does contain some information that might not be publicly available yet, but it's a piece of analysis that's been done on one particular system, and it just tries to show you the ways in which looking at the architecture of the system, the flow of the data, the ways in which that might not be done adequately enough can lead to some very significant vulnerabilities that are there in many ways in which the system can be attacked. So having said all of that, and probably indicating some of the ways in which it seems to be a little bit overwhelming, it does come back to the question that Alice posed to the Cheshire Cat. She really doesn't know what to do next. And of course, the answer is, if you don't know where you want to go, it doesn't really matter what you do. So we need to have some means of evaluating and taking some priorities and taking some steps or directions to go. I would suggest that, as with so much else in the way of testing, risk-based is clearly a direction that you want to use to set priorities and think about adequacy. We talk about return on investment, the ratio of how much improvement you get or how much return there is for some investment that you make. Return on security investment, the denominator here, is basically measured in terms of how much we might reduce risk exposure. And if you remember, the elements of risk include risk avoidance, making it less likely the bad thing happens, and risk mitigation, making sure that the results don't have to be as bad as they could have been. So the risk avoidance, if you go back to your original framework we looked at, the identify and protect part of that cycle would be to protect as well as you can the resources in the degree in which it's important to have them protected. But certainly recognizing that there are other forms in which we can do some risk management, and that can be in terms of mitigation. So the detect, respond, and recover elements of that framework are all crucial, because in the inevitable compromise that does occur, you can also reduce your risk exposure by how quickly you know you've been compromised, and then you move to do the recovery and the repair work that needs to be done. Risk management happens to be obviously a topic that a lot of people have contributed resources to. Back to the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, they have a number of documents, such as I have captured here, that deal with doing risk-based development and also risk-based evaluation of systems and system engineering. And so that would be one of the key ways in which cybersecurity testing would contribute to that kind of risk management. because cybersecurity is really essential to all aspects of information technology and all aspects of software quality and software testing, it's really going to be important that this kind of insight is available to everyone as broadly as possible. And so I just want to conclude on a final note by indicating that we'll talk later about some ways in which at SQA is making available some material, some outlines of some content, and ultimately some certifications of what would be essential for people across the whole broad area of software and software testing. And that within that, one of the elements of testing essentials is everyone needs to have at least some level of appreciation for cybersecurity testing. So within this particular body of knowledge or syllabus, and ultimately the certification based on that, there are a number of areas in which we are making available that kind of at least high-level information and ways in which people can evaluate and demonstrate that they have that basic understanding. This is really a subject for more detail, both the broader topic of certification, lifelong learning, and staying on top of things, which obviously is going to be true in any technical area, but particularly in terms of security, and specifically the ways in which we're trying to make that information available and encourage people to be more professional in cybersecurity and cybersecurity testing. But I will certainly take the advice that for the purpose of what I want to do today, I have accomplished covering that material on what types of ways in which cybersecurity testing is different. Briefly, the adversarial nature in which the software doesn't just break on its own, but people are trying to break it and take advantage of it. The idea that the key element of the adequacy of your testing is the adequacy of the threat modeling, and that therefore you have to span not only all of the software development life cycle, but also what I would call the attack life cycle, in which not only you have to protect your assets, but also be aware of how well you're doing the identification of detecting and then responding and recovering from those attributes. Thank you.
Taz, I want to thank you for taking time to discuss the idea of cybersecurity testing and how it differs from general testing. I especially appreciate some of the Alice in Wonderland references. The final one where it said, you know, when you come to the end, but I suspect that there is no end when it comes to cybersecurity testing. Would you say that this is an area in which you can know everything, which is virtually impossible by itself, but once you know everything, it will probably change again yet tomorrow? Does that sound right?
Yes, I mean, the snapshots we're looking at maybe here are the top problems today, but there'll be new ways that someone will find to take advantage of that in the future, and you need to constantly be monitoring that. Exactly. That's why we'll come back for some more insights in continuing episodes. Thank you.
This is great. All right, thanks, and thanks to everyone who is watching the webinar, and we invite you to continue to look for other resources on the atsqa.org site. You will find more information on the topics and items that Taz mentioned, and we'll continue to add to that body of knowledge going forward. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Taz, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future on this and other topics.